Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the third chapter in the book of Amos, and the foundation point we want to proceed from is the opening verse of the first chapter, which reads, "The words of Amos, who was among the herdsmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." So Amos is his name, and his name translates as burden bearer, and that's what a lot of the prophets do. They bear the burdens of the sin of the nation. They bear the burden of knowing their consequent doom and destination. And he was a prophet, but he was not a prophet by profession or vocation. He was not a courtier or a sophisticate, but he was a shepherd from Tekoa, which was a town located some 6 miles south of Bethlehem and 11 miles from Jerusalem. So he was a Judean by background, and he ministered when Uzziah was the king of Judah. Uzziah reigned from 792 to 740 BM before Messiah, and Jeroboam II ministered in Israel from 793 to 753. This makes Amos contemporaries with Jonah and Hosea, I believe. But the bulk of his ministerial activity, the most reliable estimate, is the decade between the 760s and the 750s. And in the opening chapter, he pronounces judgment on a lot of the neighboring nations, Damascus, the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Edomites are mentioned. So an Israelite audience, he is a Judean writing to an Israelite audience, because in the second chapter, and then he writes that Moab is essentially doomed and destined, yet then he turns on Judah and Israel in the 4th and 6th verse, respectively, of the preceding chapter. And then in the third chapter, he lays out his case, why this is happening to them. Why are they being judged? Why are they? And we get a prelude of that in the 13th verse of the second chapter. "See, I am weighed down by you, as a wagon is weighed down when filled with sheaves." So the covenant people had become an intolerable burden to the one who had initiated the covenant, and he destined them to swift perishment. And then he elaborates more fully on in the third chapter what his case is against Israel, why he is judging them so severely. And so the opening verse reads, "Hear the word that Yahweh has spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the entire clan which I brought up from the land of Egypt, saying, You alone have I known of all the clans of the earth. Therefore I punish you all for all your wickedness." So the first two verses, which are a single sentence, define they're an act of grace, and it is also a witness to the effectiveness, because he did deliver them and redeem them from bondage in Egypt and made them a nation to people, and they had an exclusivity in this relationship. "You alone have I known of the clans of the earth." The word translated as known is intimate. It roughly translates as a man might know his wife, but spiritually speaking, not sexually. But even though he knows every created Gentile, he was uniquely related to the nation of Israel, who knew who he was. The other nations did not. "So you alone have I known of all the clans of the earth. And because I had entered into a covenant with you, I am going to punish with you." And because of the exclusivity of their calling, they had grown privileged and entitled. But with privilege comes the responsibilities. They had to bear and honor and uphold their end of the covenant in order to remain and prosper and flourish in their land. And during the reigns of Uzziah and Jeroboam, both the kingdoms of northern Israel and southern Judah were at peace with themselves and the world. So this was a moment of tremendous commercial growth, but it was the autumn before the winter of judgment. Then in verses 3 through 6, he asks a series of rhetorical questions of causes and effects. We just want to bear that in mind before we ask and answer and interpret and elaborate on each one. Would two walk together without having met? Obviously harming, there's no reason for two people to meet and walk together for a united purpose unless they already knew each other. So the meeting is logically prior to the walking together. So that is a self-evident rhetorical question. And when two men walk together, that is better than when they are walking apart or separate. So when two men walk together, that is the bond and glue for unity through which teamwork can be accomplished. But it all requires knowledge of the person you're walking with. Does a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? Does a young lion give forth his voice out of the den unless he has caught? So the word lion, I believe, appears at least one other time later in this chapter. I could be wrong, but maybe hold that thought and just focus on the question. And the answer is that there's no reason to roar when there is no prey, when there's nothing to hunt or kill. There's no reason to roar. There's no reason to make itself known or establish its dominance over something that isn't even there. And a young lion, would he similarly make his voice known out of his den unless he has caught? So unless he had successfully hunted his animal, he would have no reason to roar or boast or advertise or make itself known. Does a bird fall into a snare on the earth where there is no trap for it? Does a snare spring up from the earth if it is not captured prey? So without a snare, a bird is going to be able to fly free all across the sky wherever he wants, all across the world, unless a trap is there which contains or controls or limits the spread of its wings, without which it cannot fly and travel as a creature at perfect liberty and will to fly wherever it wants. A trap interferes and obstructs that entire purpose. And the purpose of a snare is, of course, to capture a prey. So in the nature, in the food chain, there are predators and there are prey. Lion is an example of a predator. Birds are mostly prey, although there are some predatorial birds. If a ram's horn is blown in a city, do the people not tremble? If there is a calamity in the city, should not Yahweh have done it? So a ram's horn was the instrument of the watchman, and it is to the prophet Ezekiel who elaborates most fully on the relationship, the metaphorical relationship of the prophet to a watchman. Every city in the ancient world was walled. There's a reason that no walled city ever didn't exist or spring up, and the answer is because that city would have been reduced to smithereens. Walls were functionally necessary for the survival of a city, and they were guarded by watchmen who blew ram's horns or instruments of loud noises to warn when there was an onslaught or an enemy approaching their city with sieging equipment. And that would have been a cause to tremble, because that means there is danger making its way close to you. And of course, if there's calamity in the city, is not Yahweh responsible for it? Now, Yahweh is not responsible for every evil in the world, but sometimes he does visit and inflict evil on evil people, and he does it for a reason, which is always and only righteous. For the Master Yahweh does not matter unless he reveals his secrets to his servants, the prophets. So I think the better translation is the Master Yahweh does not act unless he reveals his secrets to his servants, the prophets. So he keeps nothing hidden. There is no warning that should not have gone unheeded. He does not pronounce judgment without giving ample warning. And the trajectory of prophets had been saying the same thing for the course of several centuries, which was very little original material. It was to stick to the Mosaic covenant, do not violate it, and to honor and uphold it, to claim the blessings of the covenant. And the servants, the prophets were his servants, and they functioned as covenant enforcers. So their job was to remind the people of their covenantal obligations and responsibilities and demands and duties. A lion has roared. Who is not afraid? The Master Yahweh has spoken. who would not prophesy. So there's that word again, lion. We read it earlier in one of the series of rhetorical questions, most of which pertain to animals. So the lion has roared. This strikes fear into all who hears it. A lion is a beast, the most supreme, magnificent, and physically dominant and predatorial beast. It is the dominant species with the exception of humanity. And that causes fear in animals and even humans who hear it. And if now Amos's message was not his own, he was an humble shepherd man. He wasn't educated or trained to be a prophet, yet he was called to be a prophet nonetheless. And as the voice of divinity spoke to him, so too did he speak, write, and record and proclaim the message of divinity that he had given to him, because when one is inspired, it is an irresistible urge. So when one is spoken to by Yahweh to speak to the world, they're going to speak to the world no matter what. Cry out at the palaces of Ashdod and at the palaces in the land of Egypt, and say, gather on the mountains of Samaria, and see the many unrest in her midst, and the oppressed ones within her. Ashdod was a city of the Philistines, and the Egyptians were, of course, another nation. These were habitual enemies of the Israelite people, although there were certain times when Egypt was an ally, but the Philistines were Aegean pirates. But nevertheless, these Gentiles were being called to witness against the oppression which was endemic in Samaria. So with prosperity came an uncontrollable gap between the rich and the poor. The poor did really... the rich really did profit against the poor. I think it's an overly simplistic explanation for why certain people are richer than others and poorer, but there is it was the case in this historical scenario. Samaria was not concerned with the widows or the vulnerable of society. They were only concerned with themselves, and as we eventually read, they had winter homes and summer homes, so they had more than one houses. They were prospering financially. The problem was they were neglecting the call for social justice, which was embedded in the Mosaic covenant. But they do not know what is right, declares Yahweh, those who store up plunder and loot in their palaces. So he's charging their wrong action with being in deficient knowledge. So if they knew what was right, they would do what was right, but they didn't know that what was right. They were more concerned with their self-interest, self-aggrandizement, self-gain, self-exaltation, self. It was the sin of self. They had palaces, and they plundered and looted the palaces from the profits which were illicitly gained at the expense of the poor. So all their wealth accumulated came through robbery and theft, and they were not mindful of the people they had robbed it from. Thus said Yahweh, as a shepherd rescues from the mouth of a lion 2 legs or a piece of an heir, who are the children of Israel, who dwell in Samaria, to be rescued, in the corner of a bed, and in Damascus on a couch. So Amos, remember, is a shepherd who was called to be a prophet. So he has the mind of a shepherd. He's relating to something, a familiar sight and spectacle. A lion would have been a beast that shepherds would have had to be attentive towards, because they would devour and consume the shepherd, being, sources of meat. And so that was the present predicament of the children of Israel. They were being consumed, and most of them didn't even know it. Remember, they were living in the autumn of the autumn of bliss before the winter of judgment. And they had 2 homes in 2 places. By this point, the Samaria's influence had spread to Damascus, so much so that commercial contacts were so embedded there that rich merchants and investors had homes in both cities. Hear and witness against the house of Jacob, declares the Master Yahweh, the Elohim of hosts. So he has something to say against the house of Jacob, that's the house of Israel, and he's going to witness and testify against it. He's already given his court case, but he's not quite done yet. And Elohim of hosts is a military term, and a lot of modern and pacifistically minded people reject or struggle or altogether eliminate the idea of a militant deity. But God is a warrior. It's almost in every chapter of this book, whether we like it or not. We have to treat him as he is, and he is a prince of peace, but he is also a mighty warrior and a conqueror, and capable of violence in defense of what is good and true and innocent. For in that day I visit Israel for their transgression. I shall punish concerning the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be broken, and they shall fall to the ground. So the entire reason that Israel was being judged and conquered and spread across a vast empire with their ethnic homogeny compromised, diluted, and watered down was rooted in its original king, Jeroboam, who set up an idolatrous shop at the location of Bethel. We can read of this in 1 Kings, the 12th chapter, 26 through 33rd verses. What happened is because the temple remained in the southern kingdom, all the faithful Levites kind of gravitated there. So Jeroboam hired these priests who introduced pagan, idolatrous elements in them. And the reason they fell a lot quicker and their judgment came sooner than Judah is because every single king from Jeroboam to the final one of the northern kingdom of Israel was invariably an idolater, whereas those of Judah, there was no settled or fixed pattern, but it was a general pattern where a reformer would tear down the idols of their predecessors, then an idolater would set up new edifices and altars and sacrificial centers to them. And I shall smite the winter house along with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall be swept away, declares Yahweh. So all their gain, all their accumulation, their possession of winter and summer homes, one in one city, another in the other. They even had houses of ivory. There is archaeological excavation which proves that ivory adorned the homes of many wealthy people at this time. It would have been an African import. But all these great houses, none of them are still standing. None of them are left. None of the palaces of antiquity remain with us. Very few actually do. Architectural gems and wonders which once were treasures of the earth have been swept away in the sands of time. So nothing on this earth lasts forever, but there is something that does last forever, that is eternal salvation, and we have the guidelines in this book to live worthy of being saved. I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.